Hello and welcome to another dose of Dr. Owen's Muscle Medicine. Today's video is all about the scientific evidence for or against the use of the popular weight loss supplement HMB. Expect to learn what the science has to say on HMB's role in helping build and maintain muscle mass, its effects on exercise-induced muscle damage and associated soreness, how it affects body composition, its effects on circulating blood cholesterol, and the evidence for its safety. But before we start, it's important to note that all these studies pair HMB supplementation with exercise, and as far as I've seen, there's no evidence to suggest it will improve body composition without exercise. So, does HMB make a meaningful impact on body composition in well-trained athletes? There's a mighty fine question, and one that scientists really are yet to come to an agreement on, with particular nuance around study participants' pre-study level of physical training. To date, we have 2 published systematic reviews and meta-analyses that ask the question of whether HMB supplementation increases muscle mass and/or reduces fat mass in trained athletes, and both research groups found the same answer. Our currently available pool of data from published peer-reviewed RCTs fails to find any statistically significant effect in either case. However, several individual studies do find a positive effect, and what they all have in common is that they last at least 6 weeks, and the training protocol used by the researchers pairs HMB with progressive overload resistance training. Nonetheless, it seems that if you want to find an effect, you should go looking in untrained individuals embarking on a new progressive overload regime. If you want to find no significant benefit over placebo, study trained athletes not being asked to do anything new or different in their training. Let's have a look now at those untrained individuals. Well, HMB supplementation plus graduated resistance training has outperformed graduated training in untrained athletes repeatedly starting in 1997, with positive effects both to muscle mass and strength, manifesting from as early as 3 weeks. Though a note of caution here that the lead author on this paper also holds most of the HMB-related patents and makes a lot of money out of HMB supplementation. Interestingly, this study compared HMB doses of 1.5 grams per day, 3 grams per day, and 6 grams per day, and found that 3 grams was more effective than 1.5, but that 6 was no better than 3. Almost every study undertaken since has used 3 grams per day as the protocol, but perhaps we might benefit from another look at some other dosing regimes, particularly in trained athletes. The important question here is, why the difference between untrained and trained athletes? And the answer is that we cannot readily infer what characteristics seems to set athletes and untrained individuals apart. However, one of the research groups to conduct a review on HMB supplementation postulated that because HMB seems to moderate muscle damage and inflammation, which we'll get to, it might be that those new to exercise, whose muscles are less well conditioned to the demands placed on them, stand to gain more from HMB supplementation. And some of the studies of trained athletes had them following their normal training protocols that may not have employed progressive overload to stimulate adaptation. Another theory is that athletes may be better dialed in on nutrition before supplementation, including protein intake, and the same effects might be achieved by the ingestion of other substances. Lastly, it might be that body composition changes in already trained athletes tend to be smaller than those experienced by people newly getting into exercise, which we know to be the case. So if there were real effects on muscle mass or fat mass to be had by athletes adding it to their program, perhaps they're too small to have been borne out in the small handful of relatively low power, small scale, short-term studies conducted. Now, more on HMB and its effect on body composition. This time, 14 studies looking into the effects of HMB supplementation at 3 grams per day, paired with physical training, mostly resistance training, and the effect on body composition. This was published in the International Society of Sports Nutrition's position stand on HMB supplementation back in 2014. It's important to note that they're all pretty short-term, with the longest study lasting 12 weeks and the shortest only 3. But the overall picture here is a positive one, with 4 studies finding no statistically significant difference in body composition. Of these, one of them didn't even attempt to measure it, and 6 studies showing an increase in fat-free mass, a proxy for skeletal muscle, of between 0.6 and 3% over a matter of weeks. Of the 3 studies that measured body composition that failed to find a difference, 2 of them did not define whether there was progressive overload or even a strength focus to their training. For all we know, they may have been doing sport-specific skill training or, worse yet, cardio. Just kidding. Sort of. Next. What about taking HMB whilst cutting? Well, this is a doozy of a question because people looking to lose body weight in the form of fat are also at risk of losing it in the shape of muscle. So anything that can prevent the latter whilst we work on the former is worth knowing about. Does HMB help with this? Well, this 2013 study published in the scientific journal Metabolism does sound promising, with the investigators finding that a combination of resistance training and HMB supplementation helping to preserve muscle mass compared with calorie restriction and exercise without that HMB supplementation. But the fly in the ointment here is that all we have to go on is this one short-term study on mice. and 0 published human studies researching the specific question in healthy, well adults. On the other hand, there is lots of promising data, medically unwell individuals with specific conditions leading to muscle wasting states. So it's important to note here that this is not a proof of an absence of effect, but so far as I can tell, at the time of recording this video, there is a complete absence of evidence that HMB plus resistance training helps preserve muscle mass when cutting or in a calorie deficit over resistance training alone, because the science has not yet been published. Next, what is HMB's effect on exercise-induced muscle damage? Well, as you can see here, we again have a heterogeneous or mixed picture of some studies sometimes finding a positive benefit in terms of blood markers of muscle breakdown and damage, and some studies finding no effect. Again, we have those no effect studies found in these football camp training groups, and we have a large positive effect in the study conducted by Steve Nissen, who owns all those patents for HMB. However, the take home here is that muscle damage, as measured by creatinine kinase, tends to go down in progressive overload training when taking 3 grams of HMB per day. And the penultimate issue to cover before safety is HMB and its effect on cholesterol circulating in the blood. Now, as cholesterol is a metabolite or product of HMB, within the cells, it's reasonable to ask the question whether or not dumping significant amounts of extra HMB into our bodies might have an effect on our cholesterol levels, remembering that substrate availability is not always the rate-limiting step in any given bodily process. Happily, the science community has also had this wondering a few times by now, and on the screen now is a graph published in a 2024 systematic review of all the available studies looking into HMB supplementation and its effect on blood lipid levels. There were 12 human randomized controlled studies looking at HMB supplementation over a period of up to 12 weeks. And here we find in the top left the effect of HMB supplementation on triglyceride levels. In the top right, the effect of HMB supplementation on low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs. In the bottom left, the effect of supplementation on total cholesterol. And in the bottom right, the effect of supplementation on high-density lipoproteins. The overall effects are shown by the diamonds at the bottom of each diagram in their close relation with the thick vertical line down the middle, which represents no effect of HMB versus placebo, led the authors of the paper to conclude that at the time of publishing, we have a moderate to low quality of scientific data showing no overall effect of HMB supplementation on blood lipid levels. Sweet. And lastly, is HMB supplementation safe? Well, it seems to be. So far, we've given it to rats at a much higher dose, and they were fine. We've studied it at 6 grams per day for a month, and its effects on blood levels of cholesterol and liver and kidney markers, and found no significant effects, and 2 meta-analyses of the published RCTs found no concerning safety features. But the studies are quite short-term in nature and hardly ever exceed 3 grams per day. So, in summary, HMB seems to aid muscle recovery and muscle mass and strength gains when combined with progressive resistance, particularly in previously untrained individuals, but the effect sizes are relatively modest. And it seems safe, and 3 grams per day seems the go-to regime. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.